days, where weapons of fire have been rightly used, neither horse nor man is able to bear armour sufficient to defend their bodies from death.
Ironically enough, the longbow is a ballistically superior weapon when compared to the musket. It has a much longer range, 3 to 4 times. The archer can shoot at a much higher rate than a musket. And yet, there's one fundamental disadvantage to the musket that the longbow has that Humphrey Barwick missed, and that's the economics.
For years, the longbow helped the British to win battles against their enemies, but guns were simply cheaper. A skilled archer needed a lifetime to train. A skilled gunman needed only weeks. Military armor, already thickened against the longbow, was made even stronger to protect against bullets. But muskets, the more powerful cousins to the arquebus, could pierce armor at close range, heralding the end of early warfare's most romantic symbol, the mounted knight.
A musket ball, when contacted with armor, what it'll do, it will pierce the front plate. Losing a lot of its momentum after that, it will hit the back plate and then bounce back toward the front. And you will get this ball bouncing back and forth. This literally turns into a small meat grinder, tearing everything up inside.
Another innovation would also spell trouble for the armored knight. It was called the wheel lock, first developed around 1500. While the matchlock needed its priming pan open just before firing, the wheel lock did it automatically. And the clumsy burning match was eliminated completely with the newer weapon.
To operate the wheel lock, we wind the wheel.
It used a spring-loaded wheel to make sparks, something like a modern-day cigarette lighter.
The pan cover is closed. We place the dog on the pan, then pull the trigger.
The wheel lock made it possible to carry a musket, preloaded, ready to fire. Expensive and complex, this weapon was too costly for ordinary infantrymen, who usually had to buy their own weapons. But it was not too expensive for a new kind of mounted soldier, armed with wheel-lock pistols.
How did firearms put an end to knighthood? The wheel-lock pistol is the critical device because it could be carried charged and ready to fire at a moment's notice. With 2 or 3 of these, a rider could approach to within a very close range of a mounted knight, and any shot that hit was likely to be devastating, even if he missed the knight, or even if the knight's armor was more or less bulletproof, the horse was almost certain to get it.
And if the noble knight could be struck down by the shot of a pistol or musket, what would become of the tradition of chivalry? Where were the heroes on the field of battle? The gun changed the meaning of such things.
Gunners at the time were an interesting soldier. They were actually looked upon with a little bit of disdain because the musketeer was considered more like a murderer, a thug. It wasn't very noble to stand there and, reach out and touch somebody at a long range. But they learned very quickly that musketeer was quite valuable.
And in my duty towards Her Majesty's country, thus I do conclude with my opinion touching warlike weapons and the use thereof.
In the time of Humphrey Barwick, at the close of the 16th century, the age of the knight was coming to an end. But the gun was yet to become the principal weapon of warfare. Guns were still slow to load and so inaccurate, they were often more disruptive than destructive to an attacking army. The weapon that would change history still had far to go before it would leave its mark. In the 15th and 16th centuries, a new light was shining on Europe. In Italy, Leonardo da Vinci exemplified what we now call the Renaissance man: artist, inventor, philosopher. Leonardo was one of many men who accepted commissions not just for works of art, but for instruments of war. Another Italian applied his great learning to the flight of cannonballs. He was mathematician Nicola Fontana Tartaglia, and in 1537, he published the first book on a science now known as ballistics.
Why should gunners, or at least gunnery commanders, care about books on artillery? Well, for starts, it minimizes the training costs. If a gunner already knows the basic properties of a ballistic trajectory, he doesn't have to spend that time wasting ammunition discovering it for himself.
Pure science, it turns out, would be essential to the advancement of guns, and some of the most revered scientists in history would play their parts.
Galileo is, of course, famous for his basic discoveries in astronomy, such as the use of the telescope to discover the moons of Jupiter. But he also had to earn a living as a mathematician, and in order to do so, he spent a good deal of his life applying mathematics and mechanics to solving fundamental military problems.
Among Galileo's contributions was the military compass, a handheld calculator Renaissance style. An improvement on earlier instruments, it allowed gunners to measure the elevation of their cannon and figure the amount of powder they needed without having to do pages of difficult calculations. Advancing the work begun by Tartaglia, Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, and others created the scientific groundwork that would give commanders their first true understanding of the complex trajectories of artillery shells. In the ranks of infantry, though, pure science would be little help for the next 2 centuries. Muskets would continue to be fired en masse. Because they were so inaccurate, few shots ever hit any target. One scholar calculated 260 bullets for every man hit. Others, more pessimistic, estimated 3,000 to 10,000 shots had to be fired to produce just one casualty. Today we can understand the musket's performance by looking at a baseball pitcher and the spin he puts on his curveball.
Once the ball comes out of the musket barrel, it has a spin, and this spin will cause the ball to curve just like a pitcher will cause a baseball to spin, as in a curveball. The problem is the spin is random, and so beyond a 100-yard range, it is almost impossible to tell where this ball will end up.
The solution to the accuracy problem would eventually come in the form of the rifle. While other guns were smooth inside, the rifle's barrel had spiral grooves, making the bullet rotate as it's fired, just as a football rotates in a forward pass. Like the football, the spin makes the bullet fly straight.
Okay, the target that we're shooting at today would be small and relatively out of range for a musket. But with a rifled gun, such as this one, it's a piece of cake.
Standing more than 50 yards away, the rifle is aimed at a target that is only 8 inches square, far smaller than the silhouette of an opposing soldier. Even an unskilled rifleman can make the shot with little chance of missing. Now, a smoothbore musket is fired on the same range. The random spin of the musket ball will make it fly in a curved path. Hitting the target will be mostly a matter of luck. The rifle's superiority was outweighed by its high cost and the slow loading of its tight-fitting bullet. So with the inability of muskets to find their targets accurately, gunmakers looked for other ways to improve them. By 1620, a new kind of lock appeared, making the musket easier to use than ever before. It was based on the well-known practice of striking flint against steel to start fires. It was called the flintlock.
The way this works is you'd start off by pulling the cock to half cock so that it couldn't go off prematurely. Then you would charge the pan with primer, fill the pan, close the pan, pour the balance of the powder into the bore, and with the powder in and the patch and the ball ram it home. Then he would pull the cock to full cock, and now it's ready to fire.
And so the flintlock became yet another gun to give us a colorful saying. Its safety feature, allowing the cock to be locked in mid-position, made commanders tell their men never to go off half-cocked. Until the much later arrival of practical rifles, the flintlock would remain the pinnacle of technology in military shoulder arms. It was inexpensive, easy to use, and faster to load than anything that came before. The paper cartridge, introduced by Sweden's King Gustavus Adolphus in the 1630s, further simplified the loading procedure, increasing the musket's speed. And in the quest for speed, commanders created what has become the modern military philosophy. Formal training, uniform clothing, standardized weapons, a new mechanical approach to war, much of it to increase the rate of fire in a gun that would otherwise be a failure.
One of the reasons why this attitude of mechanizing infantry troops was so important was to optimize the lethality of smoothbore muskets. One analogy you can think of is that when you have a squadron or a company of soldiers firing the muskets simultaneously, the effect is that of a giant shotgun blast.
With faster firing, soldiers no longer needed to stand in massive block formations. Instead, they spread out in linear ranks, 2 or 3 deep. After the early 1700s, a flintlock musket with a bayonet attached was infantry's primary weapon. The pikes, spears, and lances of antiquity had finally disappeared. The power of guns became unchallenged, but their role would soon change to challenge the power of kings. In the world of the 17th century, the power of Europe encircled the globe. Great Britain took its place among the empire builders, establishing colonies east and west, with troops and their guns to protect them. But in North America, those guns would seed the clouds of revolution.
What they had in America was a militia system that required every able-bodied man to have a firearm. And although they didn't train constantly with it, they were more familiar with it, say, than their European counterpart. And in fact, in Europe, except for a little bit of a tradition in England of this, most of the continent did not have militias, because after all, if you arm your populace, kings are facing a potential rebellion.
Britain's militia system in the colonies helped it protect them without the expense of additional troops. But guns in America had an even older tradition. Any hardy soul living in the countryside needed a gun as a useful tool for hunting and for protection against animals, hostile natives, or criminals. But by 1775, guns and politics arrived at a crossroads in the countryside of Massachusetts.
Despair! Despair, ye rebels!
Without guns in the hands of the colonials, the shot heard round the world might never have been fired at Lexington Green. And though it began a revolution that the Americans won, they were easily beaten by the British that day in 1775. Less well known is the beating the Redcoats took on the road back to Boston, when patriots in the Massachusetts countryside badgered them every step of the way. Using the smooth-bore guns so common then in American households. During the war, a few Americans harassed the British with straight-shooting rifles, but it was an expensive weapon and not as widely owned as many people think.
The rifle in trained hands can be a very effective weapon. But a few riflemen picking off officers or being able to pick off a few people on a battlefield is not the way you win a war. What helped win American independence was using European-style guns with European-style tactics.
With rifles yet to fulfill their promise, the flintlock musket remained the primary weapon used by soldiers in the Revolution. When rebels met redcoats, each side pointed muskets at the other. The Americans ultimately forced to fight the British in the British style. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, one of the Revolution's most famous commands was shouted by American General Israel Putnam as the British approached.
The command, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," could have been given by anybody on any battlefield at that time, because muskets were most effective under 100 yards and could be devastating at 50 yards or less. So waiting until you could see the whites of their eyes would be a command that you'd hear in Europe as well as in America.
The Americans might have won Bunker Hill, but as well as they fought, they had to retreat when their gunpowder ran out. In fact, the story of the gun in the Revolution was more a tale of supply than anything else. Facing critical shortages, General George Washington got most of his guns from France, knowing the professional British Army could not be defeated with patriotic zeal alone. Washington was also well aware of the scientific skill needed for battlefield artillery. For this reason, he chose a bookseller with little military experience as the commander of his big guns.
Henry Knox, before the Revolutionary War, owned a bookstore, which he specialized in military literature. As a good bookseller, he, of course, wanted to familiarize himself with the literature. During the Siege of Boston, he presented himself to General George Washington, and George Washington was so impressed with his qualifications in both theory and basic military practice that he immediately made him the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army's artillery.
Knox's first command took him to the woods of New York in the winter of 1775. His assignment? Taking 120,000 pounds of captured cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, dragging them through the snow, and placing them on the hills above Boston. As a result, the British were forced to end their occupation of the city. Knox would apply his skill throughout the war, taking it even to Yorktown, where he commanded the artillery at the battle which forced the British to surrender. But a different uprising would help write a further chapter in the gun's role in battle. The French Revolution led to the age of Napoleon, a powerful, enigmatic leader, who first rose through the ranks on his textbook knowledge in the use of cannon.
Few people are aware of the fact that Napoleon's early military career and his early military successes were directly dependent on his extremely high-level prowess as a calculus student. He was originally an artillery officer, and he got into that line of work, so to speak, because of his high scores in mathematics.
It was the age of reason in which science was applied to everything, including the fighting of wars. There was one textbook Napoleon certainly knew inside out, The New Principles of Gunnery, written by British scientist Benjamin Robins.
What Robins did was to engage in the first highly accurate experiments to investigate the basic ballistic properties of a musket ball. This was, of course, the ballistic pendulum.
It's an invention most people have never heard of. Built in 1742, the ballistic pendulum was deceptively simple. A gun was fired at the pad, and a tape recorded the pendulum's swing, which gave us the bullet's speed, something no one had ever been able to measure before. From that, Robins calculated the last great unknown in ballistics, the role of air resistance, which he found to be 120 times greater than the force of gravity. The work of Benjamin Robins and those that went before him made field artillery increasingly accurate, an absolute necessity when smoke-filled battlefields obscured all but the first shot. Cannons were now lighter, and their large-wheeled carriages made them far more maneuverable. The addition of a small elevating screw made aiming easier than ever before. Ammunition diversified, with shotgun-like grape shot used at close range and primitive exploding shells at long, The most common load, however, remained the simple iron cannonball.
The primary artillery tactic using the solid iron balls was to ricochet or skip them across the ground into a body of troops, cavalry or infantry. And even though a small ball doesn't seem to carry that much punch, the fact is, even at a slight angle, it could take out 6 or a dozen men as it tore through the ranks, inflicting horrible wounds. To a body of troops that wasn't experienced or not veteran, this could be very unnerving.
Even more unnerving was a new kind of exploding shell, a British invention of 1784. Lofted above a formation of troops, it was designed to explode in midair. The inventor was a man whose name is familiar to all of us today, Lieutenant Henry Shrapnel.
Shrapnel exploding shells were probably the most effective during this period, much better than just regular exploding shells because they contained extra balls inside that spread out in a lethal pattern and could hit far more troops if it hit near them.
The shrapnel shell was just one development at a time when gun design was advancing quickly. But 500 years had elapsed since guns were first used. During that time, progress was slow. Even small improvements took decades or even centuries. Still, governments and generals never gave up and never stopped seeking more.
Gun inventors have always had the incentive of reward or profit, even if it's under the guise of patriotism. And military leaders always want the next best weapon to give them an edge on the battlefield. And that goes on regardless of the technology, and no matter how long it takes. The search for the better gun never ends.
In the first part of the 19th century, early gun technology was at its height. Only the future would supply a common soldier's weapon that would shoot with accuracy. Cannons firing shells that would explode on impact. Bullets fired by machine guns that would change the battlefield so drastically. The era of early guns had come to an end. The tales of their successors were yet to be told.
Thank you for watching this edition of the American Rifleman Video Collection. Proceeds from this program support the NRA's efforts. We're proud to present this unique collection, which so clearly illustrates the history and evolution of guns. By collecting these videos, you'll appreciate like never before the fascination and the power of guns, entrusted to us all.